Right now, stop and ask yourself one simple question. Have you ever felt a strange, inexplicable dissonance while inside an old railway station? You stand beneath vaults that stretch tens of meters into the sky, surrounded by marble, granite, and stucco work on par with ancient temples, and you wait for a dirty, noisy, soot-spewing steam locomotive. We've been lied to our whole lives that these palaces were built specifically for trains. But what if I tell you that trains are merely a facade? What if these colossal structures stood here long before the first steam engine ran on rails? You have been deceived. We have all been deceived. The official history of the 19th century is falling apart at the seams, if only you remove the textbooks and engage elementary logic and engineering thinking. Look at the station in Antwerp. Gaze upon Grand Central Terminal in New York, or Vitebsky Station in St. Petersburg. These are not transportation hubs. These are temples. These are resonators. These are remnants of a civilization whose technological level we still cannot comprehend. And today, we will tear away this curtain of lies. Let's start with a fact that historians meticulously avoid. We are told that the mid-19th century was the era of the Industrial Revolution, a time when humanity, having barely emerged from feudalism, suddenly began constructing structures of such complexity that even modern architects, with their computer modeling and laser levels, throw up their hands in despair. We are asked to believe that people who traveled by horse and lit their homes with candles created domes capable of covering a football stadium using only a chisel, a hammer, and enthusiasm. Do you seriously believe this? Look at the doors of these stations. Enormous, massive openings 5, 6, and sometimes 8 meters high. For whom were they made? For a person of average height, 1.70 meters? Or perhaps for beings of entirely different dimensions? Official science will tell you that this is merely architectural grandiosity, a pursuit of grandeur. But in engineering, there is no place for empty pomp when thousands of tons of stone and metal are involved. Every detail has a functional purpose, and if doors 3 stories high exist, it means someone entered them. Pay attention to the very combination of technologies. On the one hand, we have these majestic cathedrals that we call stations, perfect acoustics, incredibly complex geometry, the use of polygonal masonry and materials whose processing requires numerically controlled machine tools. And on the other hand, a steam locomotive, a primitive barrel of water heated by coal. The efficiency of a steam locomotive is negligibly small. It's a dirty, sooty, vibrating machine. And you want to tell me that crystal palaces were built for this smokehouse? That's like building an opera house to store manure. Logic is completely absent here. The cargo cult theory seems far more probable. We didn't build these stations. We found them. We are a civilization that came upon the ruins of a more advanced world, excavated these giant complexes, cleaned them of dirt and clay, and adapted them to our primitive needs. We laid tracks where flows of entirely different energy once ran. Recall old engravings and photographs from the mid-19th century, the very ones where cities appear empty. Vast squares of St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, and not a soul. Only rare figures of people in rags who look alien against the backdrop of cyclopean structures. Historians explain this with the long exposure times of old cameras. Allegedly, people moved, which is why they aren't visible. But why then are trees visible, swaying in the wind? Why are horses visible? Why do shadows fall at different angles as if the sun shone from several directions simultaneously? The truth is far more terrifying. These cities were empty because their builders disappeared. And those we see in the photos are the first settlers, inhabitants, those who were brought in to develop the vacant real estate after a global catastrophe. And the first thing the new masters of life began to do was rewrite the purpose of the buildings. Power stations became churches, factories for extracting atmospheric electricity, city halls, and giant transport portals and acoustic resonators turned into railway stations. Let's talk about figures that make official historians' hands tremble. Let's take the construction of Cologne Cathedral, which is in immediate proximity to the main station and forms a single architectural ensemble with it. We are told it was built for 600 years. 600 years! Can you imagine a construction budget for 6 centuries? No state, no church could sustain such a protracted construction. This is economic suicide. But if we look at photographs from the 19th century, we will see that the cathedral stands, and around it, ruins and dirt. And suddenly, in just a couple of decades, it is supposedly completed. Where did the technologies come from? Where did the masters come from? And most importantly, where did the resources come from in Europe, exhausted by endless wars and epidemics? The answer is simple and frightening. It wasn't built. It was restored. What survived the flood was rebuilt. Stations worldwide share identical architecture, from Bombay to London, from Moscow to Melbourne. Everywhere we see the same arched structures, the same domes, the same spires. How is this possible in a world without the internet and instant communication? How could architects from different continents build according to the same blueprints, adhering to a single standard down to the millimeter? The official version of a fashion for antiquity does not stand up to criticism. Fashion is decor. But here we see a unified engineering standard. This was a global, unified civilization. A world without borders, connected by a network of high-speed transport or perhaps teleportation, of which these very stations were the nodes. Arched vaults are not just a roof. They are a form perfectly suited for creating standing waves and vibrational fields. Trains have nothing to do with it. These buildings generated, accumulated, or transmitted something, and this something was far more important than delivering coal from Manchester to Liverpool. Look at 19th century railway maps. The network is so dense that modern logisticians can only dream of it. In the United States of America, by 1860, over 30,000 miles of tracks had been laid. By whom? By a population barely recovered from the Civil War? By people with pickaxes and shovels? The volume of earthworks involved in laying so many tracks is comparable to the construction of the Great Wall of China. Excavating soil, creating embankments, tunneling through rocks without dynamite. Do you understand the sheer scale involved? That's millions of cubic meters of rock. Where did they put this earth? Where are the spoil heaps? There are none. The roads often run in cuttings, as if sliced by a giant laser or milling machine into the body of the planet. And these tracks lead directly to our giant stations, entering them like a plug into a socket. We are approaching the most interesting part. If stations are not just waiting rooms but complex technical devices, how did they work? Why are there no furnaces and chimneys in old stations in the quantity needed to heat such enormous volumes of air? In Russia, where winter temperatures drop to -30, there are huge halls with incredibly high ceilings, and it's warm inside. How? The ventilation and heating systems we find in the basements of these buildings have nothing to do with burning wood or coal. These are channels, air ducts permeating the entire building. Caloric heating, they tell us. But where is the heat source? Often these channels go deep underground, to places where we are not allowed, to where the true foundation of our civilization is hidden. And now, as we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this mystery, prepare yourself. What I'm about to tell you next about the underground levels of stations and the real dating of brickwork will turn your perception of reality upside down. Let's descend below ground level, to where the most inconvenient questions for official historical science are hidden. Have you ever noticed the windows of the basement floors of old railway stations? Walk around the perimeter of any major railway terminal built in the 19th or early 20th century. You will see full-fledged, full-sized windows, half or even 2/3, submerged in asphalt or soil. Tour guides and architectural textbooks will call these light wells for illuminating basement premises. But reflect for a second on the absurdity of this explanation. Why would an architect design a giant window, decorate it with complex masonry, architraves, and keystones, and then bury it in the ground, leaving a narrow slit into which dirt, water, and snow constantly fly? This is engineering madness. No one in their right mind would spend resources on decorating something that will be buried under a layer of soil. These windows were not intended for basements. These were first-floor windows. Station buildings, like many historical structures in the centers of our cities, are buried several meters deep in soil. The official version states that this is the so-called cultural layer. Allegedly, people for centuries did not clean up after themselves, did not clear roads, and the ground level gradually rose. We are asked to believe that 2 or 3 meters of dirt accumulate in 1 or 200 years. Can you imagine a city dweller wading knee-deep in waste and simply building a new sidewalk over the old one, bricking up the doors and windows of their house? This is a lie designed for those who have never held a shovel. The cultural layer grows by millimeters, not meters, and certainly not in the centers of imperial capitals, where cleanliness was maintained more rigorously than it is now. The buried first floors of stations are direct evidence of a catastrophic event that we call the flood of clay and mudflow. Mudflows covered the cities, and the survivors simply had to adapt the surviving upper floors for new entrances. Stations were not built on the ground, they were excavated. And often not fully excavated because there weren't enough hands or equipment. Now let's talk about logistics and materials science. This is the area where official history suffers a complete fiasco. Take any large station supposedly built in the mid-19th century. It involves millions, tens of millions of red-fired bricks. To produce such a quantity of building material, gigantic factories operating around the clock are necessary. Where are these factories? Where are the clay quarries of such a scale? If you calculate the volume of brick in the historical center of London, Moscow, or Chicago, the entire surrounding area should be riddled with quarries, and the sky should be black with smoke from the kilns. But on old maps, we don't see industrial zones of that scale. Moreover, the bricks need to be transported. In the mid-19th century, the primary transport was a horse and cart. The carrying capacity of a cart is limited, roads are broken or non-existent. Try to transport 1 million bricks by cart through mud. This is a logistical challenge that would take decades, and we are told that stations were erected in 2 or 3 years. Let's move on. Metal structures. Giant open-work arches of train sheds spanning railway tracks. This is hundreds of tons of high-quality metal. In the 19th century, metallurgy, according to textbooks, was just beginning to develop. But we see structures that surpass modern ones in quality of execution. Look at the rivets. Millions of rivets. Riveting technology requires heating metal to red hot and striking it with a hammer or press. How was this done at a height of 30 meters without safety harnesses, without cranes, with such precision that even after a century and a half, these joints do not rust or deteriorate? Chemical analysis of the metal in old structures often shows an astonishing purity of alloy that is difficult to achieve even in modern open hearth furnaces. This iron practically does not corrode. Compare it to a modern fence that will rot in 10 years. We are dealing with a lost metalworking technology that was available to the builders of these objects, but whose secret was lost or deliberately hidden. And now for the most important revelation concerning the railways themselves. We are told that the Trans-Siberian Railway, the Great Siberian Way, was built in record time using primitive manual labor. Convicts with wheelbarrows and shovels laid thousands of kilometers of tracks through taiga, swamps, and rocks. Do you believe it's possible to manually, without excavators and dynamite, cut clearings through solid rock, build perfectly level embankments tens of meters high, and construct bridges over Great Siberian rivers in such a short time. Calculate the cubic meters of Earth moved. That's billions of cubic meters. Even with modern machinery, it would take years. There is a theory that explains all the inconsistencies. Railways were not built, they were restored. This was an ancient transport network of a global civilization that was destroyed and covered with soil. The builders of the 19th century simply followed old clearings, excavated preserved embankments, and laid new sleepers on an already prepared, compacted foundation that had existed for centuries. That's why many railways run in strange, deep canyons with smooth walls. It's not an excavation of soil, it's a trench dug in a layer of sedimentary rock that covered the old world. Pay attention to the demographics of that time. The Earth's population at the beginning of the 19th century, according to official data, barely exceeded 1 billion people. Large cities housed hundreds of thousands, not millions. Where did the human resources for such grandiose constructions come from? Who are all these people who built canals, railways, stations, factories, palaces? If statistics are to be believed, every second adult male should have been a builder or stonemason. And who then grew the bread? Who fought in endless wars? Who worked in factories? The numbers don't add up. Either the population was much larger and there was a sharp extinction that is being hidden from us, or these objects were built long before the emergence of the official 19th century civilization. We live in ghost cities, built by giants for giants, and we try to convince ourselves that these are the handiwork of our great-grandfathers, who could barely read. Look at old maps of star fortresses. Many stations stand precisely on the foundations of these mysterious structures or are integrated into their geometry. A station is not just a point on a map, it is a node of power. Now let's look up to those very domes and vaults that inspire awe in us. Have you ever wondered why the roofs of stations are so structurally similar to the roofs of cathedrals and temples? Official science mumbles something about aesthetics and light, but let's speak as engineers. A dome is not just a beautiful roof, it is a technical device. In physics, the shape of a dome and a sphere is ideal for accumulating static charge and concentrating wave energy. Look at old photographs of stations before the so-called 20th century reconstruction. What do you see on the spires? There are no flags, no crosses. There are complex metal structures, spheres, hedgehogs, grids. These are not decorations. These are receiving antennas. These are terminals for collecting atmospheric electricity, the very ether energy that Nikola Tesla spoke of, and which has been erased from all physics textbooks. Imagine a giant network, stations, cathedrals, city halls, all united into a single energy system. The metal frameworks inside the walls, which we discover when demolishing old buildings, are current conductors. The dome collects charge from the ionosphere, the metal reinforcement transmits it downwards, and the granite columns, containing quartz, act as piezoelectric elements. The entire station is a giant power plant and simultaneously a distribution node. Light in these buildings burned without wires or light bulbs. Recall descriptions of electric weddings or 19th century balls where the air glowed on its own. We are told it was gas lighting. But have you ever seen a gas jet that can illuminate a hall 30 meters high as brightly as in old paintings? This is a lie. Gas pipes were laid later, cutting into the magnificent marble finishes, disfiguring the walls, just to somehow illuminate these spaces when the free energy of the ancients was cut off. This is precisely why stations have such excessive height. A steam locomotive doesn't need a 50-meter ceiling. Smoke perfectly exits through a normal exhaust. This volume is needed for resonance. We come to another shocking function of these structures: acoustic levitation and teleportation. Sound is vibration. A certain frequency can change the structure of matter. The arches of stations, their geometry, their proportions. All of this is tuned to generate standing sound waves. Perhaps the trains of that civilization did not run on rails. Perhaps they moved through space using acoustic corridors, and the giant arches were entry and exit portals. And we, like savages who found a microscope, started using it to hammer nails. We laid primitive rails and ran our rattling carriages on them. Now prepare for the darkest part of our investigation: demographics and children. Have you heard the term orphan trains? In the United States of America and Europe in the mid to late 19th century, a strange, terrifying phenomenon was recorded. A huge number of homeless children, hundreds of thousands of them. They are loaded onto trains and sent from overcrowded cities on the East Coast to settle the Wild West and Siberia. Where did these armies of orphans come from? Where are their parents? Official history mumbles about epidemics and poverty. But the numbers don't add up. Such a surge in orphanhood is only possible in one case: if the adult population was wiped out almost instantly. We are the descendants of these orphans. We are a civilization raised in incubators. Our memory was erased, we were given a false history, and sent to populate empty cities left by giants. Those very orphan trains arrived at these magnificent stations. Children stepped onto the platforms, saw these cyclopean vaults, and thought that great ancestors had built them. But they did not know that their parents had disappeared during a catastrophe now called the Clay Rain or the Great Reset. Stations were distribution points for surviving biomaterial, centers for sorting humanity after the system's reboot. That is why they evoke a subconscious anxiety in us. Genetic memory screams to us that this place is not for travel, but a place of exodus, a place where the fate of our species was decided. Recall your feelings in a crowd at a station. Fatigue, emptiness, headache. This is not just from the noise. You are inside a giant resonator that is out of tune. It no longer harmonizes space. It acts as a vibration dampener, suppressing will and consciousness. Authorities are well aware of this property. It's no coincidence that during revolutions and coups, the first things seized are post, telephone, telegraph, and railway stations. Control over a station is control over the vibration frequency of an entire city. By shutting down this node, the population can be thrown into panic or apathy. There is another fact that simply screams of inconsistency: the size of the steps. In many old stations, if you descend into service areas or ascend the towers, you will find staircases that are uncomfortable for an ordinary person to use. The steps are either too high, 40 centimeters, or too narrow. This is not ergonomics for a person of our height. This is ergonomics for beings nearly 3 meters tall. Recall the atlases holding the porticos of buildings in St. Petersburg. These are not mythical heroes. These are self-portraits of the builders. We walk through their homes like mice in an abandoned mansion, and we don't even notice that the doorknobs are at the level of our faces. Now that we have realized the technical impossibility of building these colossal structures by people in bast shoes with wheelbarrows, let's ask the most terrifying question. Where did the builders go? Why did the magnificent palaces we call stations stand empty and filled with dirt in the mid-19th century? We are approaching the culmination of our investigation, and this truth may cause you a feeling of deep internal protest. But you must know this: we live in a graveyard. Our entire civilization is built upon the bones of giants. Official history calls the 19th century the age of steam and electricity, an age of progress. But the facts scream the opposite. It was an age of survival, looting, and total cleanup of the traces of a global war. Look closely at the facade masonry of many stations and the old buildings adjacent to them. You will see strange marks: melted brick, flowing granite, stones turned into a vitrified mass. Historians will tell you that these are the consequences of local fires, but the temperature of an ordinary wood fire does not exceed 800 degrees. For granite to flow like wax, a temperature above 1200 degrees is needed, and the impact must be instantaneous and powerful. These are traces of the use of high-tech weapons, thermonuclear or plasma, call it what you will. Our stations are surviving bunkers, their powerful walls, their foundations sunken down floors, their lead linings between blocks. All these are elements of protection against radiation and shock waves. That is why they survived. That is why they became centers of crystallization for a new, primitive civilization that grew up on the ruins. Let's reevaluate the very concept of the Industrial Revolution. We are told that humanity suddenly became smarter and began inventing machines. But what if the revolution was merely a process of de-preserving surviving workshops? What if the first steam locomotives are not the brilliant invention of Stephenson or the Cherepanovs, but an attempt to launch auxiliary, emergency generators on wood because the main reactors of the ancients were destroyed or silenced? We found these machines, we found these rails, and we began to use them in the most barbaric way. Railways in the first decades after the catastrophe were not used for transporting passengers in top hats and crinolines at all. That is a lie from pretty pictures. The first trains carried out dirt. Ponder this image. Millions of tons of clay and mudflow-covered cities. The first floors were buried. Streets were impassable. To excavate even the center, mountains of earth had to be removed. Where to? Out of the city. That is precisely why the tracks were restored. Trains laden with dirt, broken bricks, and remains moved out of the cities day and night. This is the true purpose of the industrial boom. We were cleaners in a house whose owners had perished, and only when the main debris was cleared, when the cultural layer was paved over with asphalt, were trains given a noble appearance and opened to the public to create the illusion of normal life. Now recall the Great Fires, the Chicago Fire of 1871, the Moscow Fire of 1812, fires in San Francisco, Seattle, Boston. They followed a single pattern. The city burned to the ground. To its foundations, stone and metal melted. And literally a few years later, a new, completely rebuilt stone city emerged in its place, with a layout suspiciously resembling a microchip. They try to convince us that this is a coincidence, that a cow knocked over a lamp. Do you believe that a metropolis of stone and brick burns down from a single lamp? This was a cleanup. Those blocks that could not be restored or excavated were simply destroyed, wiped off the face of the earth to hide the traces of the catastrophe and build primitive boxes for the new population in their place. And the stations were left. They were too valuable as communication and control nodes. We are approaching the most cynical part of the global deception. The replacement of elites. Those who govern the world today, whose headquarters are often located in historical centers, are not the descendants of the builders. They are invaders, marauders who were the first to get their hands on stores of knowledge and technology. They appropriated these palaces. They called themselves kings, presidents, and magnates. But look how ridiculous they appear against the backdrop of this architecture. Modern presidents, speaking against the backdrop of the giant columns of the Capitol or the Kremlin, look like children wearing their father's jacket, which is 5 sizes too big for them. Our entire culture is permeated by this discrepancy. We paint pictures that bear no comparison to the canvases of the Renaissance. We build buildings of glass and concrete that will fall apart in 50 years next to eternal granite embankments. We are a civilization of degradation, not progress. Does it not outrage you that the truth about our origins is hidden from us? We have been made to believe that we evolved from monkeys, that we progressed from a digging stick to an iPhone. This is done specifically to kill in us the sense of greatness, so that we don't ask the question, why can't we build such a station today? The answer is simple: because we have lost the technologies, the knowledge, and perhaps the very genetic ability to create at the level of gods, we have been turned into consumers. We have been driven into concrete cages, given 8 hours of work a day, so that we have no time to lift our heads and look at the vaults of the station, at these star maps frozen in stone. Do you feel this cold, which comes not from the walls, but from the realization of reality? We live in an artificial matrix. Historical chronology is stretched like rubber. 1,000 years of the Middle Ages were invented to hide the gap between antiquity and us. Antiquity was not 2,000 years ago. It was yesterday. Literally 200 or 300 years ago, those who built these arches walked here, and the catastrophe that destroyed them happened quite recently. Your great-great-grandparents might have witnessed this horror, but they were forced into silence or had their memories rewritten. Perhaps those very asylums that opened en masse in the 19th century were intended for those who remembered the truth and refused to believe in the new, fabricated reality. But the traces remain. They are everywhere, in giant doors, in windows underground, in polygonal masonry that cannot be replicated, in star fortresses scattered across the planet. And stations are the most obvious, most accessible witnesses for the prosecution. They stand as silent rebukes to our blindness. Every time you buy a train ticket, you pass through a portal that was not created for you. You enter the territory of an alien dead god. And the system fears that one day you will stop in the middle of the main hall, look at the dome, and realize humans with hammers could not have built this. Something else was here.